Welcome to my channel. The Dark Slave. Examine the pattern adorning Kaza Dorn's head. Marlowe Creel took it for a path to liberation. He was mistaken. The woman he intended to chase had devoted years to committing the Louisiana marshland to memory, and those braids were never designed to show her the way. They were designed to show him. Every twist, intersection, and abrupt termination pointed toward locations where solid ground became treacherously soft beneath a horse's weight. Creel was convinced he'd pilfered her secret. That secret had been deliberately placed for him to uncover. By the moment comprehension dawned, Keziah had already begun steering him back to the site where her husband had vanished. Louisiana, 1856. At the boundary of the Acapulco hinterland stood Mere Cross Plantation, a sugar estate. Cultivated fields bordered it on one side, cypress swamp on the other. The fields could be quantified. The swamp defied quantification. Plantation thoroughfares terminated where dark water commenced. Narrow ribbons of stable earth could vanish beneath reeds. Waterways shifted following heavy precipitation. Cypress roots broke the surface like obstacles scattered without design. A stretch of greenery appearing dependable from horseback could conceal mire deep enough to ensnare an animal before the rider grasped the peril. The men governing Miros regarded the swamp as worthless acreage. Kaza Dorn understood otherwise. She had dwelled alongside it long enough to perceive distinctions most outsiders never observed. She studied the water's coloration. She took note of insect congregations. She recalled which cypress trunks leaned toward elevated terrain. She could detect when footsteps ceased striking compact soil. Then they began pressing into something softer beneath the surface. None of this was supernatural. It was wisdom accumulated through repetition, coerced labor, careful observation, and the instinct for survival. That distinction carries significance. Enslavement relied on more than physical domination. It relied on controlling movement, information, and the conviction that those held in bondage possessed less understanding of their surroundings than the people asserting ownership over them. Keziah shattered that assumption simply by knowing more. She was approximately 36 years old. She labored in the domestic yard, the storage structures, and performed various routine duties around the main residence. Her hands were prized for their exactness. She could mend torn fabric, separate tangled threads, and braid hair tightly enough to maintain its form through days of labor. Marlowe Creel observed the skill but misinterpreted its significance. Creel served as overseer at Merecross. He was approaching 50. He had invested years constructing his authority around a single principle. Nobody under his command was permitted to possess knowledge he could not access. He inspected implements he didn't know how to operate. He interrogated workers about conversations that didn't concern him. He entered dwellings without warning. He was less interested in what people had done than in what they might know. That habit had already claimed one life close to Keziah. Her husband, Tavian Dorn, had worked with the timber crews dispatched deep into the cypress country. Those crews traveled where wagons couldn't follow. They traced elevated ground, shallow waterways, and old timber paths through inundated woodland. Tavian learned those routes because ignorance there could mean injury, lost equipment, or a night stranded without a dependable path back. At home, he described the swamp to Keziah. Initially, the two transformed those descriptions into a private system. It wasn't a code employed across plantations. It wasn't a secret language familiar to everyone around them. It belonged exclusively to them. A curved braid could represent a watercourse. A tightly woven section could signify stable ground. Two lines converging could mark a junction. A sudden break meant danger ahead. The pattern shifted depending on what Tavian had observed. For Keziah, braiding became a method of preserving his descriptions. For Tavian, it became a means of testing whether he had articulated the route clearly. They were constructing a shared recollection of the swamp without paper, permission, or witnesses. Creel eventually discovered that Tavian knew the back country better than he did. That discovery offended him. Years earlier, Creel had compelled Tavian to guide him through the swamp during a search for missing livestock. Near a cluster of cypress, Tavian cautioned him against pushing a horse across a bright stretch of grass ahead. Creel disregarded him. The animal sank almost immediately. Tavian helped drag it back toward firmer ground. He had been corrected. Worse, he had been corrected by a man he believed he had the right to command. Following that day, Creel observed Tavian differently. Several years later, another pursuit entered the swamp. Tavian was again forced to serve as guide. The details that returned to Mere Cross were deliberately imprecise. Creel claimed Tavian had become separated from the group. Then he claimed Tavian had lost his way. The assertion made no sense. Kezia knew precisely how carefully her husband read that terrain. Creel came back without him. He carried one item that Tavian had been wearing when he entered the swamp. He handed it over without explanation. Then he told Kezia that her husband had finally gotten lost. She didn't challenge him. That silence was mistaken for submission. In reality, it became memory. Years passed. She continued braiding hair. She continued hearing Creel's boots cross the yard. She never received a body. She never received a location. She never received the truth. What she did receive was time. By 1856, small irregularities began appearing around Merecross. A key went missing and later reappeared. A blade couldn't be found where it had been stored. Food disappeared from a shelf. None of it proved an escape plan. None of it threatened the plantation economy. But Creel wasn't responding to evidence. He was responding to secrecy. He began watching Kezia more closely. He saw her pause near the edge of the swamp. He noticed that she looked toward certain trees before turning back. He began entering spaces shortly after she left them. Kezia noticed that, too. Then she gave him something to see. One late afternoon, she sat near the rear of a work building with her hair partially divided into narrow sections. Her fingers moved slowly, not casually, slowly enough to be observed. The new pattern was unlike the practical braids Creel had seen before. Several rows curved sharply toward one side, 2 lines crossed near the crown. Another ran backward in a straight path before ending abruptly near the base of her head. Creel stopped. Kezia didn't look up immediately. When she finally realized he was there, she covered part of the pattern with both hands. The movement lasted only a moment. It was enough. Creel asked what the braids meant. Kezia said nothing. He stepped closer. She turned away from him. That was the answer he wanted. From that moment, Creel no longer saw a hairstyle. He saw concealed information. He became convinced Kezia had placed a route across her own scalp. The idea fit every suspicion he already carried. She knew the swamp. Her husband had known the swamp, and now she was hiding a pattern from him. Creel believed he had discovered an escape map. What he had actually discovered was bait. That evening, Kezia did something that should have contradicted every assumption he was making. She left a trail, not an obvious one, a disturbed patch of earth near a fence, a footprint where the soil remained soft. A broken reed near the first dark water. Someone desperate to disappear would have avoided those mistakes. Kezia made them deliberately. She wasn't trying to escape Creel's attention. She was controlling it. By nightfall, word reached the overseer that Kezia was missing. Creel reacted exactly as she expected. He called for horses. He ordered the dogs brought out. He chose men who would obey quickly and ask questions later. The plantation had taught him to read pursuit as proof of power. He thought whoever ran was at a disadvantage. That belief was about to be tested. Before the posse entered the trees, Creel stopped near the edge of the swamp. He closed his eyes. He pictured the pattern on Kezia's head, the curved rows, the crossing lines, the abrupt ending. He believed he had stolen her route before she could use it. Then the dogs found the first trace leading into the cypress. Creel mounted. The group followed. Somewhere ahead, Keziah was already moving across ground she had known for years. She wasn't searching for the way out. She was waiting for Marlowe Creel to choose the way in. Keziah had already begun the trap. The first stretch of swamp gave Creel exactly what he wanted. The dogs pulled hard toward a narrow opening between two stands of cypress. Their handlers followed on foot while the riders kept to the higher edge of the trail. Keziah's tracks appeared often enough to confirm direction. A heel pressed into damp soil. Reeds bent low beside shallow water. A smear of mud across an exposed root. Nothing suggested confusion. She was moving steadily southwest. Creel kept the posse close. He didn't want anyone racing ahead and taking the capture from him. Near the first channel, the tracks stopped. Water covered the route for nearly 20 yards. The dogs entered without hesitation. They splashed through until the scent weakened on the opposite bank. One circled toward the left. Another pulled right. The handlers corrected them and tried again. Creel remained mounted. His attention had shifted away from the animals. He was looking at the landscape. A narrow channel curved ahead before disappearing behind cypress. He had seen that curve somewhere else, not on paper, on Keziah. He raised one hand and stopped the group. The nearest handler looked back. The dogs were pulling toward higher ground on the right. Creel pointed left. Take them there. The handler hesitated. They're giving right. Creel repeated the order. The man obeyed. They crossed the water and forced the dogs along the left bank. Within minutes, another footprint appeared in mud beneath a fallen branch. That was enough. Creel's confidence changed. Until then, he had been following Keziah. Now he believed he was reading her. The distinction made him more dangerous. He began reconstructing the braids from memory. The curved line near her temple, the crossing near the crown, the narrow section that ran backward before splitting. He had watched Keziah cover the pattern too quickly to inspect every detail. He didn't need every detail. He believed the swamp itself was filling in what he had missed. A bend in the water matched a bend in the braid. Two strips of raised ground met where two rows had crossed. A long narrow ridge resembled the straight line running toward the back of her head. Each apparent match reinforced the next assumption. Creel stopped treating the pattern as a possibility. He treated it as proof. The posse continued deeper. The plantation disappeared behind them. Cultivated ground gave way to flooded woodland, and the horses had to move in single file across narrow stretches where their weight pressed water from beneath the soil. Keziah remained ahead, not visible, not yet. Creel pushed the pace. A handler warned that the dogs needed room to work. Creel ignored him. The animals were no longer the center of the pursuit. They had become confirmation. When they pulled in the direction he expected, he praised their accuracy. When they pulled elsewhere, he assumed water or vegetation had confused them. The method had reversed without anyone openly acknowledging it. Creel was no longer following the dogs. He was forcing the dogs to follow his interpretation of Keziah's hair. That shift mattered. A hunting system meant to find someone had become subject to one man's certainty that he held her secret. Late in the afternoon, they reached a fork where the ground divided around a dark pool. The dogs dragged hard toward the right. Creel studied the left path. It was narrower. A low branch partly concealed the entrance. Beyond it, a line of cypress curved away in the same direction he remembered from one of the braids. He ordered left. This time the handler resisted. She crossed right. Creel turned toward him. The man pointed at the ground. There in soft mud beside the water was part of a footprint, recent, clear, right side. Creel stared at it for several seconds. The evidence challenged the pattern in his head. Then he looked beyond the mark. The right path widened quickly. Too easy. Too visible. He decided it was false. She doubled back. There was no sign she had. But Creel had reached the point where contradiction no longer weakened his theory. It strengthened it. If Keziah knew she was being pursued, he reasoned, she would create misleading tracks. If she had placed the real route in her braids, then physical signs could be discarded whenever they disagreed with the pattern. The posse turned left. Less than a quarter-mile later, a snapped reed appeared on the trail. Farther ahead, mud had been disturbed where someone had crossed between two roots. Then one of the men saw movement. A figure stood beyond a strip of shallow water. Keziah. She was partly obscured by the trunks, but there was no mistaking her posture. Creel shouted. She turned. Then she disappeared behind the trees. The reaction inside the posse was immediate. The argument at the fork ended. Creel had chosen left. Keziah was left. To the men following him, the decision now looked correct. To Creel, it looked like vindication. He pushed his horse through the shallows. The others followed. They reached the place where Keziah had been standing and found no clean track leading away. Water had broken the trail again. The dogs spread out. One barked toward a dense patch of brush. Another pulled backward. A third stood with its nose low, uncertain. Creel looked past them. Ahead, two raised strips of land ran roughly parallel before disappearing into thicker trees. He remembered two parallel braids near the center of Keziah's scalp. His breathing slowed. He had expected confusion. Instead, he believed the pattern was becoming clearer. The men rested the horses briefly while the handlers worked the ground. Creel remained apart from them, staring toward the twin ridges. He took a stick and drew lines in the mud. One curve, one crossing, two parallel marks, then a longer line bending west. The crude sketch was incomplete, but the act itself revealed how far his thinking had moved. He was no longer reconstructing a hairstyle. He was converting it into terrain. One of the riders watched him. "You remember all that?" "Enough." The man looked at the lines. "And if she changes direction?" Creel erased one section with his boot. "She won't." It wasn't an answer based on Keziah's behavior. It was an assertion of ownership. He believed the map fixed her choices. If the pattern represented a route, then she was bound to it. That assumption allowed him to believe he could move ahead of her rather than simply follow. The posse resumed. As daylight weakened, Keziah appeared again. This time she was farther away. She crossed a narrow opening between trees and paused long enough to look back. Creel saw her face. No panic. No frantic attempt to hide, just a brief assessment of the distance between them. Then she moved on. That unsettled one of the handlers. "She keeps showing herself." Creel dismissed it. "She's checking how close we are." The explanation satisfied him. It preserved the hierarchy he needed. Keziah was afraid. Keziah was fleeing. Keziah had made a map for herself. Creel had discovered it. Every conclusion placed him above her. The group reached another water crossing near dusk. The dogs found scent on the near bank and pulled sharply downstream. Creel looked upstream. The remembered braid turned the other way. He ordered the handlers to leave the dogs tied. The handlers pushed back at once. Without them, the pursuit would become slower and less certain. Creel no longer cared. He told two men to remain behind with the animals. The rest would continue on horseback. That decision changed the hunt. Until that moment, Creel still possessed an independent way to test his interpretation. The dogs could disagree with him. Tracks could contradict him. Handlers could point to evidence. Now he was deliberately removing those restraints. He chose the pattern instead. The remaining riders crossed upstream. The water deepened to the horses' knees before rising again onto firmer ground. Beyond the crossing, they found no footprint, no broken branches, no fresh disturbance. For several minutes, nothing confirmed Creel's choice. Then a faint sound came from farther ahead, a branch snapping. One rider pointed through the cypress, perhaps 100 yards away. Keziah moved across another opening. Creel saw the braid against the back of her head as she turned. The straight central line was visible even at that distance. He looked from her to the narrowing ground ahead. Then he urged his horse forward. Behind him, the last connection to the dogs disappeared beyond the trees. Creel had stopped pursuing evidence. From that point onward, he was following the map he believed he had stolen. Creel drove the horse forward. The ground narrowed beneath it. The men behind him were forced into single file. Cypress trunks crowded both sides of the route, and shallow water covered enough of the soil to make every step uncertain. Without the dogs, they could no longer test direction by scent. They had only Creel's memory and whatever Keziah allowed them to see. For nearly 20 minutes, she gave them nothing to find, no footprint, no broken reed, no movement ahead. Creel continued west. Hollis Vane, the rider directly behind him, began watching the ground. He stopped watching the trees. He was an experienced swamp rider, though not an expert in this part of the back country. He knew enough to recognize when a trail stopped behaving like a trail. The strip beneath them was becoming narrower. Water had appeared on both sides. Vane called forward, "This ground closes ahead." Creel didn't stop. Vane repeated himself. This time Creel turned in the saddle. "You see another way?" "Not from here." "Then keep moving." They did. Another 100 yards brought them to a shallow basin filled with reeds. The raised ground ended. There was no visible continuation. Creel reined in for several seconds. Nobody moved. Behind them, a horse shifted nervously and struck one hoof against a submerged root. Vane looked toward Creel. "This is wrong." The statement carried more weight. Now Creel had abandoned the dog specifically because he trusted the pattern. The men had followed because Keziah had appeared where he said she would. Now the route had delivered them into water with no clear exit. Creel dismounted. He walked to the end of the ridge. He examined the reeds. Nothing. He moved left, then right. The water deepened immediately in both directions. Vane remained on horseback. "You remembered it wrong." Creel ignored him. He looked back toward the route they had taken. His face tightened. Then he saw something caught against a low branch, a narrow strip of cloth. Dark fabric, freshly torn. He pulled it free. One of the men recognized it immediately. It was part of Keziah's outer garment. Vane climbed down and examined the branch. "She came through here." Creel held the cloth in his hand. The dead end stopped looking like proof of an error. Now it looked like another problem to solve. He pushed through the reeds on foot. Less than 30 feet from the end of the ridge, his boots struck something firm beneath the water. Another step. Firm again. The submerged ground curved sharply north. It couldn't be seen from horseback. Creel smiled without humor. She crossed. The men led their horses into the water. The hidden shelf was narrow enough that each animal had to be guided carefully. A single step too far to either side, a hoof into softer mud. The route eventually rose again behind a wall of reeds. On the far side they found a strip of dry ground. Vane looked back at the basin. For him, the discovery didn't settle the question. It made it worse. Keziah had passed through a place that looked impassable from the approach, and she had left the cloth exactly where Creel would find it. The possibility disturbed him. He said it aloud. "She wanted us across." Creel turned. Vane pointed toward the branch behind them. "That cloth wasn't caught low." It was hanging where a rider could see it. She tore it. Maybe. Creel stepped closer. You have something else to say? Vane looked toward the water. If she's trying to lose us, she's doing a poor job. The other men heard that. Nobody answered. Creel had spent the pursuit treating every visible sign as evidence of Keziah's desperation. Vane had now proposed the opposite interpretation, not confusion, intention. Creel rejected it immediately. She thinks we need the dogs. Vane looked at him. We left the dogs because of you. Creel's expression changed. The issue was no longer the route. It was authority. He ordered everyone mounted. No further discussion. They continued north. Keziah's trail became easier again. A print appeared at the edge of a shallow pool, then another. She had crossed a patch of mud without attempting to hide where she stepped. Vane examined the marks as he passed. The spacing was even. No evidence of running. Keziah was moving quickly enough to stay ahead, but not so quickly that the distance between them became impossible to close. That detail changed the tension inside the group. A frightened person fleeing on foot from mounted pursuers should have used every available minute to disappear. Keziah was not doing that. She was preserving contact. Near sunset, they saw her again. She stood on a low ridge between two cypress trunks. This time the distance was shorter, close enough for Creel to distinguish the side of her face. He shouted for the men to spread out. 2 riders moved immediately. Keziah turned and walked into the trees. She didn't run. Creel kicked his horse forward. The others followed. They reached the ridge less than a minute later. Beyond it, the terrain opened into several possible routes. One ran straight. Another bent east. A third descended through shallow water toward a darker line of trees. Creel stopped. He searched his memory of the braids. A crossing near the crown. 3 lines. One dominant line continuing backward. He pointed straight. Vane didn't move. Creel looked at him. Go. Vane stared toward the eastern route. There. A footprint marked the mud. Keziah had gone east. This time it was unmistakable. Creel looked at the mark, then toward the straight route. The men waited. The earlier fork had given him room to dismiss physical evidence. This one didn't. Keziah's footprint was clean. Fresh water still filled the heel impression. Creel changed direction. East. Vane followed, but the correction had consequences. Creel was no longer infallible. The men had seen him choose against the evidence and then reverse himself. They rode faster now, encouraged by the clear track. The path curved around a flooded stand of timber. For several minutes, footprints appeared in sequence. Then they stopped at another strip of water. The group crossed. Nothing waited on the far side. They spread out. Still nothing. Creel searched the trees. A faint trail continued east, but it was old enough to be uncertain. Vane walked south along the bank. He stopped near an exposed root. There was a wet footprint. Keziah had entered the water heading east. She had left it south. The clear trail had lasted only long enough to bring them to the crossing. Creel came over. Vane pointed at the mark. She turned. Creel examined the direction. South didn't match what he remembered. The pattern in his head demanded east. It was his first time since leaving the dogs. He had to choose between the braids and the visible evidence with every man watching. He chose the footprint. They turned south. Almost immediately, the route gave way. Branches hung lower. The horses had less room. The soil became soft enough that the riders dismounted and led them. Creel's irritation grew with every difficult step. Then the trees opened. Keziah stood across a narrow channel. She was close, closer than at any previous sighting. Vane saw her first. He also saw something else. Keziah was looking directly at Creel, not at the horses, not at the men spreading behind him, at Creel. She waited until his eyes found hers. Then she stepped backward slowly, one pace, then another. She disappeared behind a cypress. Creel ordered the men across. Vane stayed where he was. The pattern had changed enough that he could no longer ignore it. Every time Creel doubted the route, Keziah appeared. Every time the group risked turning back, she gave them confirmation. Every time they gained too much confidence, her trail became difficult again. The pursuit didn't behave like a chase. It behaved like controlled movement. Vane looked across the water. She's measuring us. Creel swung toward him. What? She knows how far behind we are. Creel stepped close enough that the others stopped preparing the crossing. Vane continued before he could be silenced. She could have disappeared hours ago. Creel's hand tightened around the reins. Vane pointed toward the trees where Keziah had vanished. She doesn't want distance. That accusation changed the entire pursuit. They were deep enough into the swamp that returning without the dogs would already be difficult. Creel saw their hesitation. He could either turn back and admit the hunt had stopped behaving as he expected, or he could continue and prove that Keziah was still the one being pursued. He chose immediately. He crossed the channel first. One by one, the others followed. Vane came last. When he reached the opposite bank, he looked back at the water closing over their tracks. Creel had made the choice irreversible. They were no longer following Keziah because the dogs had found her. They were following because Creel couldn't accept the possibility that she wanted them there. The ground improved just enough to restore Creel's confidence. Within several hundred yards, the narrow strip widened beneath the horses. Cypress trunks stood farther apart. The soil felt firmer. The men remounted and began moving faster, though Vane kept his horse behind the others and watched every change in the terrain. Keziah didn't appear again immediately. She no longer needed to. Creel had committed the group beyond the last reliable crossing. Every turn back would now force him to explain why he had abandoned the dogs, ignored repeated doubts, and continued after realizing Keziah was controlling the distance. Retreat had become more expensive to him than pursuit. The swamp opened gradually ahead. The trees thinned around two elevated strips of ground running almost parallel. Creel slowed. He recognized the shape. The parallel rows in Keziah's braids had remained fixed in his memory because they were among the clearest parts of the pattern. They had seemed decorative when he first saw them deep inside the swamp. They now appeared to correspond almost exactly with what stood before him. Two ridges side by side, then narrowing toward the same destination. Creel raised his arm. The men stopped. Vane looked from the ridges to Creel. No one needed to ask what he was thinking. They rode onto the left strip. The surface held. The right ridge remained visible across a shallow channel, moving in the same direction. For the next several minutes, the landscape reinforced Creel's reconstruction with uncomfortable precision. The two paths curved, then drew closer, then began to merge. The tension inside the posse shifted. Suspicion didn't disappear. It carried less force. Vane had warned them that Keziah might be controlling the pursuit. Now the swamp itself seemed to support Creel. One rider moved beside him. "This the crossing you remembered?" Creel kept his eyes ahead. "Close to it." That was enough. The men pushed on. At the point where the two ridges joined, the trees broke apart. Beyond them lay a wide, pale opening. From horseback, it looked almost like meadowland inside the swamp. Low grass covered the surface. Scattered reeds moved in the evening wind. There were no visible channels cutting across it, no dense roots, no standing water except in isolated dark patches. After hours of narrow paths and flooded crossings, the open ground looked safer than anything they had seen since leaving Miros. And across that opening stood Keziah. She was perhaps 200 yards away. No trees immediately concealed her. No wall of brush covered her escape. She stood near the far edge of the grass, with dark water visible behind her. Creel stopped his horse. The others stopped with him. For several seconds, the entire pursuit became still. Keziah faced them. She didn't turn. She didn't move toward cover. Vane studied the terrain before studying her. The arrangement was wrong. A person who had spent the entire day controlling distance had suddenly allowed mounted pursuers a clear approach. Creel interpreted it differently. He saw water behind Keziah, open ground in front of her. The route had narrowed to an apparent end. He believed the map had finally delivered what he expected from it, a destination. She's boxed herself in. Vane looked at the grass. Maybe. Creel turned sharply. You see somewhere else for her to go? Vane pointed toward the far tree line. I see somewhere she wants us to cross. Creel's patience ended. He ordered 2 riders forward. Neither moved immediately. That hesitation was small, but it was visible. Creel noticed. He dismounted, walked several steps onto the grass, and stamped one boot against the surface. Firm. He took another step. Still firm. He turned toward the men. Vane watched the ground compress beneath Creel's weight. A man on foot proved almost nothing about what would happen under a horse. Creel remounted. He did it deliberately, not because riding was necessary, because he needed the men to see him demonstrate certainty. He moved forward. The horse crossed the first 20 yards without difficulty. The others followed. Keziah remained where she was. The distance closed. 150 yards, then less. Creel could see the lines of her braids clearly now. The central pattern remained intact. For an instant his eyes moved from her head to the landscape. The 2 converging ridges behind him, the open ground, the water beyond her. He believed he had solved the final portion. He raised his voice. Keziah. She didn't retreat. Vane rode several lengths behind Creel. His horse began placing its feet more carefully. The change was subtle. One hoof went down farther than the last. Then another. Vane pulled the reins. Stop. Creel continued. The men behind slowed. Vane leaned down and looked at the ground. Water had begun rising through the grass around his horse's rear hoof, not from a visible pool, from underneath. Creel. This time the warning was louder. Creel looked back. Vane pointed downward. Get them off this. Creel's horse shifted. The front legs remained stable. One rear hoof sank several inches. Creel pulled forward. The hoof came free with a wet suction. The horse resisted the next step. Keziah finally moved, not backward, sideways. She turned along the far edge of the opening and stepped toward a line of cypress roots partially hidden by reeds. Vane saw it. She placed one foot on a narrow, dark strip no wider than a walking path. Then another. The route ran sideways across what had looked like a dead end. Creel had been looking directly at it without recognizing it as ground. His attention returned to Keziah. He kicked the horse forward. The animal took 2 steps. On the third, its front right leg dropped sharply. Creel lurched in the saddle. The horse pulled back, frightened. Another leg sank. The surface that had held a man and a few horse steps began to give. Each step made it worse. Creel drove his heels against the animal. The effort made the situation worse. Mud rose above the fetlocks. Vane shouted for everyone to turn around. The men behind attempted to reverse at once. That created the first real collapse of order. The opening had seemed broad enough for several horses to maneuver. It wasn't. Two animals moved sideways. One stepped off the compressed track created by the riders ahead. Its leg plunged deep enough to throw the rider forward against the saddle. He jumped down before the horse could fall. Another rider tried to circle around him. His horse sank at the shoulder and began struggling violently. The grass that had looked solid now tore apart under their feet. Dark water spread through it. Men dismounted. Reins tangled. Horses pulled against handlers who were trying to drag them back toward the ridges. Creel remained farther ahead than anyone else. His horse was still upright, but each movement pushed it deeper. He turned toward Keziah. She had stopped on the narrow strip near the cypress. The path beneath her held. No horse could have followed it safely. Barely enough room existed for one person at a time. Creel looked toward the ground between them. For the first time, he could see the difference. The grass near Keziah grew over exposed roots and dark compact soil. The grass beneath the posse covered something softer. The distinction had been visible. They had simply approached it from the wrong angle. Vane abandoned his horse and moved carefully toward firmer ground. He shouted at Creel to dismount. Creel didn't respond. He was staring at Keziah. She had stopped fleeing. The entire logic of the pursuit had changed in front of him. He had expected her to retreat until she ran out of ground. Instead, she had brought him to a place where she could stand still. Creel finally swung out of the saddle. The moment his boots hit the ground, one leg sank nearly to the knee. He caught the saddle and dragged himself onto a patch where the grass held slightly better. His horse struggled beside him. Across the opening, Keziah watched. There was no celebration in her expression, no panic either. Creel pointed toward her. You knew. She didn't give him the explanation he wanted. She turned and began walking along the narrow lateral path. Vane saw her disappear behind the first line of cypress. Then he looked toward Creel. The posse had entered the opening as mounted pursuers. They were leaving it where possible on foot. Several horses could no longer be moved without making them sink farther. The men who had trusted speed and weight now had to abandon both. They tested every step before committing to it. Creel had not captured Keziah. He had lost the posse's only remaining advantage, and Keziah had reached the far side without needing to run. Creel tried to pull his horse toward the firmer edge. The animal resisted. Each attempt to turn forced one leg deeper and the surrounding grass collapsed under the movement. Vane reached him from the rear and caught the bridle. Leave it. Creel refused. The horse represented more than transportation now. Abandoning it meant admitting that the pursuit had been broken by terrain he had misread. He pulled again. The animal lurched sideways. Mud opened beneath its weight. Vane released the bridle before he was dragged down with it. Leave it. This time Creel did. He backed away carefully, testing each step before shifting his weight. Two other men were already working toward the ridge they had entered from. Another remained beside a trapped horse, cutting loose equipment before abandoning the animal. The posse had stopped functioning as a unit. No one was watching Keziah anymore except Creel. She had reached a cluster of cypress on the far side and stopped beside a raised root system. The distance between them wasn't great. The ground between them made it irrelevant. Creel moved laterally, searching for the narrow route she had used. He found the beginning of it. A strip of dark soil ran beneath shallow water toward the trees. He stepped onto it. Vane saw where he was going. Creel. Creel continued. The path supported him. One careful step followed another. For perhaps 20 yards, it seemed he had found the solution. Then the strip narrowed beneath the water. Creel stopped. Keziah stood beyond him. She watched where he placed his feet, not his face. His feet. That detail forced him to look down. The safe route didn't continue directly toward her. It bent sharply around the base of a cypress. The turn was almost invisible beneath the water. Creel changed direction. His boot found firm soil again. He advanced. Behind him, Vane ordered the remaining men to stop following. There was no room to pass. Creel was moving into the swamp alone. He didn't object. The farther he went, the less willing he became to have witnesses close enough to challenge him. The narrow footing eventually rose onto a small island of packed earth and exposed roots. Keziah had moved farther back. Creel climbed onto the island. Then he stopped. Something in the arrangement of the trees altered his expression. A split cypress stood to his left. Its trunk divided low, forming a wide V above the water. 20 feet beyond it lay a fallen tree bleached along one side where bark had peeled away. To the right, 3 thick roots rose from the mud in a line. Creel looked at them, then toward a shallow channel beyond Keziah. The anger left his face for several seconds. It was replaced by recognition. Keziah noticed, that was why she had brought him close enough to see. Creel turned slowly. His eyes moved across the island as though searching for something that should no longer have been there. Vane remained far behind, unable to hear anything spoken quietly between them. Keziah took one step toward Creel. "You remember it." Creel's reaction came too quickly. No. The denial revealed more than silence would have. Keziah didn't press him with another question. She looked toward the split cypress. Creel followed her eyes despite himself. Years earlier, Tavian had described that tree, not as a landmark of escape, but as a warning. The ground beyond it looked stronger than it was. During wet months, water collected beneath the root mat. Grass spread across the surface and disguised the deeper mud below. Tavian had known the difference because timber crews had worked nearby. Keziah knew it because he had explained it to her at home. Creel knew it for another reason. He had stood there. Keziah moved toward the fallen tree. Creel followed several steps before stopping again. "You came all this way for this?" She looked at him. "This place?" His attempt to make the question sound dismissive failed. His eyes had already betrayed him. Keziah continued toward the channel. The terrain narrowed around her. She moved without hesitation. He could only follow by watching her feet. That reversal irritated.